Keith Nakamura's boots clicked in a measured cadence across polished granite, then softened to almost nothing when he stepped onto the bronze inlay ring that circled the National Tomb Annex courtyard. He knew exactly where the sound changed. He knew which seams held rainwater longest, which spotlight buzzed half a second before igniting, which corner of the North Arcade smelled faintly of machine oil after midnight, no matter how often facilities cleaned it. Precision was the point. The annex had been built for unidentified dead from 3 border wars the government still refused to call wars. No campaign names on the walls. No unit crest in the open gallery. Just dates, coordinates, weather records, and a single inscription carved above the inner chamber, for those returned without names and those not returned at all. Families came because there was nowhere else to stand with their grief. Veteran organizations came because memory was always under negotiation, and they trusted institutions only as far as they could see the hands that maintained them. Politicians came because mourning looked good on camera when framed by granite and flags. Keith came because he had made promises to men under broken concrete and burning dust. And this was one of the few places where promises still had weight. At 6'4", with shoulders that stretched ceremonial wool into hard geometry, he looked built for guard duty posters. Disciplined jaw, steady posture, eyes that never wandered. People called him stoic. He let them. It was easier than telling them silence had become habit. The week he survived an ambush, his platoon didn't. Easier than telling them that every folded flag he handled carried the phantom heaviness of one he had not been able to hand over in person. The night shift ran from 1900 to 700. He preferred it. Darkness reduced the annex to essentials: perimeter, lines of sight, procedure, weather, pulse. During daylight hours, the place became performance. Tour groups, donor escorts, staged interviews, content teams with polite smiles and production schedules. At night, there were only guards, cameras, and the dead. That week, even nights felt staged. Renovation scaffolds hugged the south facade, where limestone had been replaced. Temporary flood lamps washed the courtyard in sterile white. A new path had been poured 48 hours earlier along the east approach to the sealed inner chamber, part of a visitor flow optimization package funded by a coalition of private donors and approved in a minister's office 3 cities away. Ropes and multilingual warning signs marked it clearly: wet stone, restricted access, curing in progress. No one was supposed to be near it until facilities released the barrier. Keith had signed the overnight roster himself at 1850. 4 senior guards, 2 new recruits, 1 mobile patrol, 1 console operator. Weather advisories predicted rain after midnight. He adjusted routes to avoid blind corners in the storm and reminded everyone, again, that construction zones were non-negotiable. Eyes on rope lines every pass, he told them during briefing. If you see contamination, you report it. You don't improvise cleanup. You don't post photos. You don't talk theories. A few nods, a few tired yes sirs. Mateo Ruiz, youngest of the recruits, stood in the back with his cap held too tightly in both hands. 22, maybe 23. Good posture when he remembered to breathe. He had asked smart questions during training and apologized too often when he didn't need to. Understood, Sergeant Nakamura, Mateo said. Keith wasn't technically a sergeant anymore. The annex used civilian-military hybrid titles no one respected. But he let that pass, too. Rain came just after 100. A slow sheet turning courtyard reflections into blurred silver ribbons. By 300, it had thinned to mist. Keith ran his perimeter checks on schedule, sweeping the east side with a flashlight from distance to verify the rope stanchions hadn't shifted. They hadn't. The fresh limestone beyond looked smooth, pale, untouched. At 0450, he did it again. Smooth, untouched. He logged the check with timestamp, initials, and weather code. Old habits were armor. Near dawn, the sky turned from black to gunmetal. The first day, staff filtered through screening at 0615. Coffee smell and low conversation started to replace the hush. Keith was at the roll call desk in the operations room, removing his gloves finger by finger, when he heard a half-choked sound from the hallway. More breath than word, like someone trying not to shout in a place built for reverence. Mateo appeared at the door, face drained gray under olive skin. "Sir?" Keith looked up. "What is it?" Mateo swallowed once, hard enough to move his whole throat. "East approach." Keith didn't ask again. He was already moving. By the time they reached the arcade, 2 other guards had drifted toward the rope line, drawn by the same wrongness. Dawn light angled across the new limestone slab and made every detail cruelly clear. A sequence of boot prints crossed the wet stone. They began just inside the public arcade threshold, where no one should have stepped, and moved in an orderly line toward the sealed inner chamber door. Right foot, left foot, right, left, spaced like a person walking with purpose, not stumbling, not wandering. 11 impressions, deep enough to show tread pattern. Then nothing, no turn, no slide, no backtrack, no second set returning. The last print sat less than a meter from the chamber door, toes aimed straight at brushed steel and memorial seal, as if the walker had simply ceased to exist. No one spoke for several seconds. Keith ducked under the rope without touching the stone itself and circled along the edge, scanning for hidden overlays, drips, trowel marks, prank residue. The limestone surface was matte where curing had begun, darker where rain had pooled. The prints were crisp, cleaner than the surrounding texture should allow after a storm, and their edges held a strange uniformity that made his skin prickle. He stood, listening. No generator hum from nearby equipment, no maintenance carts, no voices, no birds yet. Just the distant tick of cooling lights and Mateo's uneven breathing behind him. "Who found it?" Keith asked. Mateo lifted a shaking hand. "I did. On morning sweep. 5:58. "Anyone cross the barrier?" "No, sir. Anyone photograph it?" A pause. "Not yet." "Good." Keith turned to the others. "Lock this side down. No one in or out of East Arcade without my say. Call facilities supervisor, duty administrator, and records control. Now." They moved because his tone left no room for doubt. Mateo did not move. Keith glanced back. "Ruiz." The recruit unclipped his badge instead. It hit the stone curb with a small metallic slap. "I can't stay," Mateo said, voice gone thin. "I'm done." Keith stared at him, not understanding for a beat. "You're in active shift." "I know." Mateo's eyes never left the final print near the chamber door. "I'm done." "You're not making decisions in shock." "Step inside, drink water." Mateo shook his head hard. No, sir. I'm not going back on that post." The other guards were now pretending not to watch, which meant they were watching everything. Keith lowered his voice. "Tell me what happened." Mateo's jaw worked as if chewing words he hated. "Those weren't yesterday's prints," he whispered, "and nobody came out." He said it again when the administrator arrived. Again when HR called him to sign departure paperwork. Again when offered hazard pay to complete his notice period. He refused the money, refused transport, refused to sit down for debrief. He only repeated that sentence, each time flatter than the last, until he walked off annex grounds without looking back. By 0730, the courtyard had become a command theater. Facilities measured humidity and curing times. An operations tech replayed camera feeds in a loop, pausing and zooming until pixels dissolved. A public affairs aide hovered at the edge with a tablet, waiting for approved language. The chief administrator, Lena Veronin, arrived in a charcoal suit with rain still on her sleeves and asked for answers before she'd even removed her coat. Keith provided what he had. Barrier intact at 0450. Anomaly discovered 0558. No authorized entry to cure zone. No visible exit prints. He kept his voice level. Veronin listened without blinking. And recruit Ruiz resigned because of this. He resigned after seeing it. That distinction won't survive the morning memo. She turned toward the stone, expression flattening into calculation. We have a ministerial walkthrough in 2 days. Veteran delegates this weekend. 2 donor crews coming for approvals. If this becomes folklore, we lose control of the narrative before noon. Control of the narrative. Keith felt the phrase land like grit between teeth. It's a restricted site, he said. Treat it as a breach until proven otherwise. It is wet concrete contamination. Limestone. Fine. Construction contamination. Same category. She faced him again. You approved last night's roster and perimeter checks. Yes. Then you will file the official explanation within 24 hours. Her tone softened in a way that made it colder. Keep it procedural, Nakamura. We cannot have ghost stories at a national memorial. The warning in that was barely veiled. Keep this clean, or be blamed for the stain. By 0900, rumors had outrun policy. A groundskeeper swore he'd heard someone humming in the east corridor before dawn. A junior clerk claimed the inner chamber sensors had glitched for 13 seconds, untrue as far as logs showed. 2 recruits asked their supervisor if transfer requests would hurt future assignments if the place wasn't stable. A Veterans Association liaison called demanding immediate transparency before official editing began. And under it all ran a quieter pressure Keith recognized from briefing rooms and command tents. If a problem threatened optics, someone would try to classify it as a misunderstanding. He stood in the surveillance room with stale coffee and watched the same 7 camera angles cycle through wet darkness. Feed 12, East Arcade, wide shot, rain glare, rope line visible. Feed 13, chamber door, fixed. Feed 14, service corridor, empty. At 412, a maintenance alert flashed, lens calibration, east cluster. The camera image jittered, blurred, then returned. Total interruption. 1 minute, 58 seconds. Routine, the console operator said quickly as if preempting accusation. Auto correction after moisture. Who initiated? System did. Keith said nothing. At 4:39, logs showed a brief power dip, too small to trigger full alarm, tagged as weather noise. At 5:02, nothing unusual. At 5:58, Mateo entering frame and freezing at the rope line. No person visible crossing in or out. Impossible footprints made good gossip and bad evidence. He printed stills anyway. When he brought them to operations, one of the private consultants hired for security modernization intercepted him in the hallway. Bryce Halden, expensive raincoat, perfect hair, smile like a proposal. Tough morning, Halden said. This is exactly why the Annex needs integrated private response. Military culture tends to mystify anomalies. Keith kept walking. Halden matched pace. No offense. But if your people start talking hauntings, appropriations committees get nervous. Funding shifts. Outsourcing becomes inevitable. There it was, naked enough to name. Keith stopped. My people don't mystify. They document. Then document quickly. Holden's smile didn't move. Before this turns into a veteran blog headline. By noon, Keith had 3 meetings, 2 contradictory directives, and a form authorizing him to submit the preliminary incident explanation directly to Command and Public Affairs. 24 hours looked generous until he started listing what he did not know. Who crossed a sealed curing path? How did Prince appear with no return track? Why did camera coverage blink at exactly the wrong moment? Why did a recruit quit like he'd seen a mine marker instead of wet stone? He returned to the East Arcade alone once the crowd thinned. Yellow caution tape had replaced rope. Evidence flags marked each impression. Rain-washed air carried limestone dust and the metallic tang of recently cut rebar from the renovation wing. He crouched near the first print without touching it. Standard issue tread pattern. Common enough. But the heel, there on the outer edge, showed a narrow crescent wear, deeper on one side than regulation soles usually produced. Not dramatic, just specific. Memory moved faster than thought. A stairwell in another country. Night vision green. A man in modified patrol boots, stepping where concrete wouldn't squeal, heel-shaved for quieter landings on urban rubble. Keith remembered because he had copied the trick once and been chewed out by his sergeant for altering issued gear. He straightened slowly, pulse ticking higher than it should. Ghost story, Command had said. Construction contamination. Administration wanted. But stone did not invent treadwear, and fear did not carve uniform depth into curing limestone. At 1307, he opened a new report file instead of the simplified template Public Affairs had attached. Incident classification. Preliminary. Unauthorized access suspected. He typed his name, the timestamp, and the first sentence with deliberate care, aware that whatever he wrote in the next 24 hours could preserve his post or finish it, and might decide whether the annex remained a place of memory or became another stage where inconvenient truths were edited before visitors arrived. He saved the draft and hit send to the secure queue before he could be talked out of his own wording. The terminal chimed once, submission received, and then chirped again almost immediately with a priority summons from administration. Veronen's office sat above the west colonnade, all glass and controlled lighting, with a view calibrated for donors. Flags, reflecting pool, not the service lanes. When Keith entered, she was standing beside a wall display of the incident stills. Bryce Halden sat in one of her guest chairs, ankle crossed over knee, as if he belonged there. "Close the door," Veronen said. Keith did. She tapped the display. "I reviewed your preliminary classification." He waited. "You wrote unauthorized access suspected." "Yes." "I asked for procedural language." "That is procedural language." Halden made a soft, sympathetic noise. "From a communications standpoint, unauthorized access implies a successful penetration. That triggers mandatory disclosure thresholds." Keith looked at him. If someone stepped onto restricted curing stone and reached the chamber approach, that is unauthorized access. "Allege it," Halden said. Veronen's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Nakamura, this institution is not helped by speculative escalation. We have no visible actor in footage, no breach alarm, no missing assets." "No missing assets yet." A beat of silence. Veronen moved to her desk and picked up a paper folder instead of the tablet in front of her. Old-school gesture, deliberate. "You have until end of shift to append supporting evidence. If you cannot substantiate unauthorized entry, we recategorize as construction contamination and close initial findings before press inquiries." Her tone stayed calm. "Do you understand?" He did. Document it now or bury it forever. Yes, ma'am. When he turned to leave, Halden spoke again, too casually. For what it's worth, Sergeant, uncertainty spooks junior personnel. You've already had one resignation. Keith paused with his hand on the door handle. For what it's worth, Consultant, uncertainty spooks people less than being lied to. He left before either answered. He spent the next hour in records and facilities, moving fast enough that no one could drag him into another meeting. Camera logs first. He pulled raw event packets instead of the polished dashboard summaries. At 4:12:08, the East Cluster entered automated lens calibration. At 4:14:06, it exited. He flagged the event metadata and traced it upstream. Command source listed as system, but the subfield that normally identified moisture-triggered routines was blank. He printed that. Power logs next. 4:39:17 showed a voltage dip across two circuits, east arcade lights and one segment of interior archive corridor, backup feed, duration 2.8 seconds. Official tag, weather transients. He compared weather station data. No lightning strike within 15 kilometers in that minute. He printed that too. Then contractor access records. Renovation crews had rotating badges with nightly sign-in on both digital scans and paper manifests for legal redundancy. The digital list showed 6 workers clocked out by 23:11. The paper list for yesterday, however, had 7 signatures on release. One name appeared as a cramped slant of ink near the bottom, M. Dacker. Keith checked the HR contractor file. No M. Dacker. He checked subcontractor annexes. No Daker. He asked records clerk Phelps to pull archive badge issuance by surname. Phelps squinted at his monitor, typed, frowned. Closest I have is a temp badge to M. Daxter from 6 weeks ago, deactivated same day. No photo attached. Now that's weird. Print it. Administration approval required for orphan credential logs. Who approves? Phelps gave him a look that said he already knew. Director Veronen's office. Keith exhaled through his nose. Email the request now and CC me. By 14:20, he had a stack of near nothing that formed an outline if you looked at it sideways. 2-minute visual gap, untimed power dip, name with no body. In the barracks locker room, one of the recruits avoided his eyes while stuffing uniforms into a duffel. Transfer paperwork? Keith asked. The recruit hesitated, then nodded. Temporary reassignment request. Reason? The answer came too fast. Family. Keith said nothing. The recruit's shoulders dropped. Sir, people are saying the East Side's wrong. That Ruiz quit because he saw... He swallowed. I'm not saying I believe it. I just don't want to be the next headline. Another recruit filed a similar request an hour later. By mid-afternoon, the annex was still running on schedule, in public-facing spaces. Tour route open, flags at regulation angle, docents on script, but beneath that, confidence frayed like wet rope. Every whispered conversation stopped when Keith walked by. At 15:10, a call came through his direct line from the Veterans Association liaison, retired Colonel Eunice Bell. Nakamura, I'm hearing conflicting stories, Bell said without preamble. If this is vandalism, say it. If this is incompetence, say that. Do not let them spin this into superstition and call it respect. I'm still collecting evidence, Colonel. Collect faster. There are people who'd love to turn unknown dead into campaign decor and erase whatever complicates the speech. The line clicked off. At 16:03, Veronen's assistant returned Phelps's records request with one sentence. Denied pending relevance justification. Relevance justification for a name on the breach-adjacent manifest. Keith felt his jaw tighten. He took his packet, camera metadata, power anomalies, manifest mismatch, to operations for formal attachment, and found Halden there, leaning over the console with two technicians. If you migrate to integrated vendor surveillance, calibration windows can be remotely audited, Halden was saying. Institutional guard units aren't built for modern threat abstraction. Keith set the packet down hard enough to make the nearest tech jump. Chain of custody this now. The tech nodded quickly and started scanning. Halden glanced at the top sheet. You're making a lot out of clerical noise. Keith met his eyes. Noise is where sabotage hides. For the first time, Halden's smile slipped. By 1740, his revised preliminary report had gone up with attachments and a request for expanded inquiry authority. No response. He should have gone off shift at 1900. Instead, he stood again at the taped-off east approach, watching evening light flatten the prints into darkened hollows. The unusual heel crescent pulled at his memory like a splinter. He crouched and counted spacing. Average adult stride, maybe slightly shortened on left step. Not a panicked run. Intentional pace. Someone performing, walking toward the door. His pulse ticked in his throat. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Rain scent had burned off. Now the air carried dust and adhesive from ongoing renovation. He closed his eyes briefly, and the courtyard dropped away, replaced by another night years ago. A half-collapsed stairwell, concrete grit between teeth, teammate whispering, watch his heels, he's wearing soft cuts. Then blast, smoke, missing voices. He opened his eyes before the memory finished, counted breath in fours. Grounded on present details, evidence flag 3 bent slightly east, tape knot double-looped, chamber door seal unbroken. A guard approached from behind. Sir, admin asked if facilities can resurface this section before tomorrow's minister rehearsal. Keith stood too quickly. Resurface? Grind and re-pour top layer. They said it's already contaminated. Who authorized that? Work order draft came from admin Q. Not signed yet. He looked back at the prints. If they resurfaced, physical evidence disappeared. End of argument. Tell facilities nothing touches this slab without my written release or military police sign-off. The guard hesitated. Admin won't like that. Then they can dislike it in writing. At 1825, he finally got what he needed to pursue the one witness who had bolted. Mateo hadn't answered calls, messages, or HR outreach, but emergency intake forms listed a secondary contact. Aunt Rosa Delgado, City Southside. Keith called, identified himself, and expected a hang-up. Instead came a long silence, then a weary voice. He's at my sister's old apartment over the laundromat on Calder Street, Rosa said. Won't sleep. Keeps saying he heard it from under the ground. Another pause. If you're calling to drag him back, don't. I'm calling to understand what he saw. She gave him the building number and disconnected. Calder Street sat beyond the river, outside annex jurisdiction, and far from ceremonial stone. Keith drove there in uniform anyway. He didn't have time to change. The laundromat windows glowed blue-white in dusk. Upstairs hall smelled of detergent, fried onions, and old paint. Mateo opened the door on the chain latch, saw who it was, and started to close it. Ruiz, Keith said, palm flat against the frame, not forcing, just firm. 10 minutes. Then I leave. Mateo stared at him through the gap. His eyes were bloodshot, jaw rough with missed shave. I already gave my statement. You gave one sentence. A long beat. Then Mateo slid the chain free. The apartment was mostly empty, folding table, 2 mismatched chairs, mattress on floor. Keith stayed standing. Mateo did too, arms crossed like armor. You said those weren't yesterday's prints, Keith began. Why? Because I walked that route at 4:30, Mateo said immediately. I checked the ropes, checked the signs. Surface was clean. Not one mark. Keith felt a small internal click. You logged 4:30? Yeah. Console should have it. It did. From 4:30 to 5:58. What changed? Mateo pressed knuckles to his mouth, thinking. I came back at, maybe 5:50 something. Still dim? I was at the arcade column, and I heard this sound. He dragged a chair leg lightly across tile to demonstrate. A dull, gritty scrape. Not on top. Under. Like something sliding beneath the slab. Keith kept his face neutral. Could be drainage shift. No. Mateo shook his head hard. I know drain noises. This was close. Heavy. Then I smelled... He frowned, searching. Like resin. Chemical sweet. Not cement. Not whetstone. What kind of resin? I used to do model kits with my cousin. Garage molds, cheap cosplay stuff. This smelled like that, but cleaner. Like the two-part stuff people use for detailed casts. He met Keith's eyes for the first time. Then I looked, and the prints were there, just there, like they'd been pressed in all at once. A chill moved up Keith's back, not supernatural, methodological. Why didn't you say this at Annex? Mateo laughed once without humor. Because everyone was already looking at me like I'd seen a ghost. If I said, sounds under the stone and resin smell, they'd put me on leave and post a wellness memo. His hands shook now that he'd started. And because if someone can do that inside a memorial with cameras everywhere, what else can they do? Keith nodded slowly. Did you tell anyone besides me? My aunt. Good. Keep it that way for now. Mateo's chin lifted, defensive again. I'm not coming back. I didn't ask. He took out his phone, opened a notes screen, and typed while Mateo watched. 05:5 scrape beneath slab. Synthetic resin odor. 4:30 visual clear. 5:58 prints present. Will you sign a supplemental statement later? Keith asked. Mateo hesitated, then gave a tight nod. If it stays on record. It stays. Keith left after 9 minutes. In the stairwell, he called the one person he trusted to read stone the way others read blood spatter. Talia, it's Nakamura. Forensic engineer Talia Voss answered on the third ring, voice clipped over traffic noise. They'd served in the same deployment, she with combat engineers, him infantry attached for route security. She'd once identified a false wall by tapping concrete with a wrench in total dark. Keith? Haven't heard that voice in years. You sound like trouble. I need eyes on a curing limestone path tonight. Possible transfer impressions. Maybe concealed seam. A pause. Official request? Not yet. So definitely trouble. Can you come? Another pause, shorter. Send location and whatever chain of custody constraints you have. I'll bring a field kit. At 2112, under work lights and after public hours, Talia stood beside the taped perimeter in a municipal forensic vest she wore like borrowed authority. Short, severe haircut now, same hawk focus. You always did know how to pick romantic reunions, she said, scanning the prints. No touching? No touching. Good. She unpacked without wasted motion. Oblique LED lamp, digital microscope, swab kit, laser level, thermal reader. 2 trusted Annex veterans, Darnell and Iqbal, both from Keith's night roster, held perimeter and logged every action on body cams per his instructions. Talia angled the oblique lamp low across the first impression. Shadows sharpened instantly, revealing micro-ridges. Huh, she murmured. What? These edges are too clean for direct footfall in rain-softened cure. See this lip? Slight displacement, outward, uniform all around. That's pressure from a shaped surface, not a dynamic step. She moved to the third print. Same result. Fourth, same. Whoever did this likely used a flexible mold and pressed each impression with controlled force. Transfer cast. Looks like it. She swabbed the margin of print 7, capped the tube, and held it up. There's a residue sheen. Could be release agent. We test, but you're witnessing resin smell? Tracks. Keith felt the floor of the mystery tilt. Talia then walked the slab's outer edge, lamp raking sideways. At first it looked like ordinary finishing texture. Then she stopped near the second stanchion anchor and crouched. Come here? He crouched beside her. There. She pointed with a capped pen. A hairline line ran lengthwise near the slab border, filled with dust slurry almost exactly matching surrounding stone. Invisible in overhead light, obvious now. Control joint? Keith asked. No, wrong placement and too narrow. This is a saw cut dressed to disappear. She ran the laser level across it. And it's not random. Straight, then slight jog around that anchor plate, then straight again. That's an access seam. She stood and scanned toward the chamber side. How thick is this pour? 4 inches over substrate, per renovation spec. Then a section this size could lift if there's clearance under one edge, not by hand from above, from below with a jack or hinge assist. Below is compacted fill and utility chase toward archive climate systems, Keith said, the words coming faster as pieces align. Service run passes under east approach before branching behind inner chamber. Talia looked at him sharply. Archive as in ceremonial pamphlets, or archive as in records, people kill careers over? Second one. The air between them tightened. Keith stared at the false footprints leading to the sealed door, now obvious as theater. A trail designed to look impossible, to bait fear, to flood rumor channels. While everyone debated ghosts versus incompetence, someone could access beneath the slab and move toward the vault that held battlefield maps, casualty ledgers, the paper spine of 3 wars nobody wanted fully named. Not a prank, not vandalism. Preparation. Talia packed 1 sample tube and handed him the chain of custody form for signature. You got a decoy operation, Keith. Somebody wanted your guards looking up at legends while they worked under your feet. He signed, date-stamped, and looked toward the dark line of the inner chamber wall. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. Then they're not done. Talia packed the last swab case and straightened. You need military police on this tonight. I need command to let me call them without burying the reason, Keith said. Then don't ask. Notify. He was already pulling his radio when his earpiece hissed, and operations came through, voice clipped and too loud. Nakamura, report to admin conference now. Director priority, bring any external personnel credentials. Talia lifted an eyebrow. That would be me. Stay with Darnell and Iqbal until I call, Keith said. No one crosses this tape. He made it halfway to the colonnade before his phone started vibrating with incoming notices. Media query pending. Facilities work order updated. Incident ticket reclassified. By the time he reached the conference room, Voronin had the wall display loaded with a clean administrative dashboard. No forensic photos, no seam markers. Halden stood beside her with a tablet and a look of patient disappointment. Voronin didn't offer a seat. You brought a civilian forensic consultant onto a sensitive memorial site without clearance. She's credentialed municipal forensic engineering. She is not on annex authorization lists. Voronin tapped the screen. And you have now contaminated a politically active scene with unsanctioned interpretation. Keith set the signed chain of custody sheet on the table. This interpretation comes with documented observations, transfer cast impressions, likely synthetic release residue, and a concealed seam cut along the slab edge. Halden glanced down, then smiled thinly. Likely. Possible. Suspected? Well, we're stacking conjecture. We're stacking evidence. Veronen's jaw shifted a fraction. Here are the facts that matter institutionally. No confirmed vault breach, no stolen assets, and an official ministerial rehearsal at 0900. I have authorized facilities to remove the contaminated slab at 0500 and re-pour before dawn. Keith felt heat rise at the base of his neck. If you grind that slab, you destroy physical evidence in an active investigation. In a maintenance incident. It stopped being maintenance when someone faked impossible prints to conceal access. Veronen's voice hardened. Careful. He held her gaze. What exactly are we protecting right now? Stone or optics? Silence held for 2 beats. Then Halden spoke lightly. Director, perhaps this is a stress response. Sergeant Nakamura has a known combat history. Pattern recognition can become over-association under fatigue. Keith turned to him so sharply the consultant took half a step back. Don't diagnose me to dodge a seam you haven't looked at. The door opened before Halden could answer. Phelps from Records stood there, face pale, clutching a printed incident sheet. Sorry, urgent. Somebody accessed the raw East Cluster archive. Veronen frowned. By who? Credential says Operations Supervisor K. Iqbal at 2058, but Phelps looked at Keith. Iqbal was on perimeter with your consultant. I checked camera at archive terminal. The feed for that minute is corrupted. Keith took the sheet. A second line hit him harder. 0412 calibration packet missing from primary storage. Check some mismatch on backup mirror. Not just pressure, active scrubbing. He looked up. Someone is deleting the exact window we flagged. Veronen moved faster than she had all day, snatching the print from his hand. IT will review. IT reports to admin. And your external friend reports to you. Her control returned like a mask sliding back on. This meeting is over. Effective immediately, all forensic activity ceases pending legal review. Your consultant leaves site. Negative, Keith said. I'm filing preservation request to military police. You are filing nothing until legal approves language. I already have chain of custody. Veronen leaned in across the table, voice low enough that Halden had to tilt his head to hear. If you force external law enforcement into this without authorization, and you're wrong, this annex loses federal oversight protections. Donor board freezes renovation. Veterans groups split publicly. Every unidentified ledger under this roof gets dragged through a partisan hearing by people who think dead soldiers are campaign props. That's what's at stake, Nakamura. He answered just as low. If I'm right and we let them work, those ledgers won't survive to be dragged anywhere. For the first time all night, Veronen looked tired, not just angry. It vanished in a blink. Dismissed. When he stepped out, Darnell was waiting in the hallway, eyes hard. You need to see East Side. Now. They jogged back. Tape still stood. Prints still visible. But at the seam Talia had marked, someone had run a bead of quickset stone filler in a careful, almost delicate line, feathered to match surface texture. Not enough to erase, enough to blur. Who was on this line? Keith demanded. Iqbal pointed toward the service stairs. Two facilities guys came with a work order and patch kit. Said admin authorized stabilization against trip hazard. Paper had director stamp. Talia crouched at the seam and swore under her breath. They didn't trip-proof. They obscured tooling marks. She rose and met Keith's stare. Your antagonist just touched the crime scene while yelling chain of command. That's escalation. Behind them, a forklift beeped in reverse near the renovation wing, and the sound felt like a countdown. Keith moved before anger could slow him. He filed an emergency evidence preservation notice through the military liaison portal anyway, attaching Talia's signed observations and the log corruption alert. The portal accepted the upload, then returned a red banner, pending command validation. He called liaison duty direct. No answer. Left callback code. At 2234, his access card stopped opening archive-adjacent interior doors. At 2236, his phone pinged with a formal memo, pending fitness review and procedural compliance inquiry. Senior Guard K. Nakamura reassigned to exterior ceremonial perimeter, effective immediately. Interior command privileges suspended. Halden's language sat all over it, even with Veronen's signature. He stood in the corridor reading the memo twice, as if the second pass might change words already weaponized. Darnell swore when he saw it. They benched you, Darnell said, temporarily. Long enough. Iqbal arrived seconds later with worse news. My body cam upload from Talia's exam just got flagged. Policy violation, unauthorized recording in donor zone. Internal Affairs froze the file. Frozen means locked, Keith said. Or gone, Iqbal answered. By 2300, Talia had been escorted off property by contract security pending credential verification. She got one text through before she was out of signal range. Kept one residue sample in personal custody. Not logged to Annex. Call when secure. A lifeline and a liability. Keith's next hit came from Calder Street. Aunt Rosa answered on the first ring, whispering. Two men came asking for Mateo, she said. Said they were from your HR. They had no uniforms. Did they touch him? No. But they knew he resigned over the footprints and told him false statements could mean criminal penalties. He panicked and left with a backpack. Won't answer me now. Keith closed his eyes briefly. Witness compromised. If he calls, tell him do not return to Annex. Tell him contact me from a public place only. You protect him, Rosa said, voice breaking around anger. You people put kids next to ghosts and then act shocked when something eats them. The line went dead. Near midnight, rain started again, thin and needling. Keith took his reassigned post at the outer ring because refusing would have handed them grounds to remove him entirely. Ceremonial perimeter meant cameras, tourist daytime path, no direct line to the inner chamber. A beautiful exile. From there he watched forklifts shuttle pallets toward east maintenance doors that should have been closed overnight. He watched 3 contract workers he didn't recognize badge through with tool cases too narrow for concrete work and too padded for ordinary wrenches. He documented times in a pocket notebook because his official terminal rights were gone. At 021, he finally got his call back from liaison duty, not a person, but encrypted voicemail. Preservation notice received. Command validation withheld pending administrative reconciliation. Do not engage unsanctioned investigative actions. Await instruction. Await instruction. He laughed once, quietly, not from humor. At 048, a memory hit him hard enough he had to brace one hand against cold stone. Not the ambush itself this time, the aftermath. Him sitting on an ammo crate while a captain explained that reports would use best available estimates for missing personnel, until identities were politically cleared, best available estimates. Language that sounded clean and left men unnamed for months. If records in this annex were altered, families would lose more than data. They'd lose coordinates to grief. Veterans who had spent years proving who died where would be called mistaken. Entire units would become footnotes. His plan, follow procedure, escalate evidence, preserve chain, had failed in every lane that mattered tonight. And for the first time since dawn, he wasn't sure he could stop what was coming. Talia Voss sat in her car 3 blocks from the annex with the engine off, hands locked around the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. Rain ticked on the windshield in irregular bursts, each tap pulling at a nerve she'd trained herself to ignore. Don't go back. Don't get pulled in. She told herself that after she left active service, after the tunnel collapse on a Route Green where she spent 19 minutes pinned under a beam and learned exactly how long oxygen could feel like a rumor. She left Engineering Command a year later, built a forensic consultancy, kept her work in daylight and above ground whenever she could. Then Keith called, with that same controlled voice he used before bad nights, and she said yes before her therapist's rules had time to object. Her phone glowed with a new lab message from her assistant who'd run a rapid strip test on the swab she smuggled out in her kit. PDMS silicone trace plus fluorinated release compound. Not construction grade, mold making or precision casting. Also metallic particulates, brass/steel mixed. Brass/steel mixed. Not from wet limestone. From old mechanical hardware, the kind legacy lift systems used before digital retrofits. She stared at the message until the letters blurred. If she sent this through official annex channels, admin could bury it. If she held it back, she became exactly what she accused them of being. Another gatekeeper deciding what truth moved and what stayed still. Her chest tightened. She forced a slower inhale. In through nose for 4, hold for 4, out for 6, the old drill. A second thought hurt worse because it had nothing to do with evidence. Seeing Keith at that slab, jaw set, shoulders like armor over old fractures. Same man who once sat beside her in a blackout shelter after Route Green and talked her through a panic spiral by reciting equipment inventories in alphabetical order until her breathing matched his. He never mentioned it again, never asked for anything back. She had spent years pretending what she felt for him was professional loyalty plus shared trauma. Manageable, boxed, the kind of thing adults with uniforms in their closets did not indulge. Tonight, watching him get isolated in real time, she knew that lie had expired. Her phone buzzed. Keith. She answered immediately. You sound like hell. Been better, he said. His voice was flatter than usual, which meant he was near a decision point. You get lab? I did. Synthetic mold release, not construction. Metal particulate suggests legacy mechanical contact. Your seam likely interfaces with older hardware below grade. Silence. Then, so they have a physical route. Yes? She hesitated. Keith, they bounced me for unauthorized presence. If I re-enter without request, I risk obstruction charges and license review. I know. Another silence, tighter. She heard herself say, I'm scared of enclosed access runs. You remember Route Green? I remember. I can still do the work, she said quickly, angry at her own voice for shaking. But if you ask me to crawl under that slab, I need you to know I might lock up for a minute. Maybe 2. I hate that I even have to say it. When he answered, it was softer than command voice, softer than she deserved right then. You don't owe me proof. You already gave me truth. Rain drummed harder. She swallowed against sudden heat in her eyes. I also don't want you doing this alone, she said. Not because you can't, because that's how they break people like us, one procedural memo at a time. A breath moved over his line, almost a laugh, almost not. Stay reachable. I may need you to testify fast. I'm not going anywhere, she said, and meant more than the sentence could hold. After they disconnected, she sent him the full lab screenshot, signed with timestamp, and her credential seal. Then she started the engine, turned the car toward a 24-hour copy shop, and printed 3 hard copies, one for him, one for municipal records, one she folded into her jacket pocket, like a promise. At 1:07, the annex issued an all-staff overnight notice. Air quality purge and archive climate loop, 1:30 to 2:15. Non-essential personnel clear interior corridors. Alarm zones 3B/3C to maintenance bypass under admin supervision. Keith read it on a shared terminal he technically wasn't assigned to touch anymore. Air quality purge during a security incident in the exact corridor network feeding beneath the east slab with alarms bypassed. Final move. He found Darnell and Iqbal in the loading bay shadow where camera coverage overlapped badly. Listen carefully, Keith said. Official channels are compromised. They're bypassing interior alarms for 45 minutes. That's our window if we're wrong, and theirs if we're right. Darnell's expression went flat. You asking for unauthorized watch? I'm asking if you trust what we saw. Iqbal didn't hesitate. Yes. Darnell took a beat longer, then nodded once. Tell me positions. Keith laid it out fast, precise, the way patrol plans used to be briefed before stepping into alleys with no maps. Leave the decoy prints visible. No confrontation in blind areas. Darnell and Iqbal switch into maintenance uniforms and hold near service junction Bravo. Keith uses his old emergency override token, still valid for legacy systems if not yet revoked, to access inner corridor and monitor seam-adjacent wall from inside camera cone. Body cams on continuous record. Timestamp every movement allowed. If command calls this insubordination, Iqbal asked. They will, Keith said. Could be reprimand, could be termination. Darnell shrugged. Can't terminate honor twice. At 1:42, Talia's lab report hit Keith's encrypted inbox, and he forwarded it to the Veterans Liaison, Colonel Bell, with a single line. If I go dark, release this to Oversight Council. At 1:51, he slipped through the side service door with a borrowed maintenance cap low over his brow. The annex sounded different during purge cycle. Vent fans rising, dampers thudding, a deep mechanical breath moving through old ducts. He reached the inner corridor and keyed the legacy panel hidden behind a bronze relief. To his surprise, the ancient interface blinked alive, manual bolts armed but not yet thrown. In his earpiece, Darnell whispered, Bravo in position. Iqbal set. Keith settled into shadow just outside the chamber approach, body cam lens angled toward the seam line and false panel Talia had indicated on the substrate map he'd memorized. 1:58. Vent noise deepened. Somewhere below, metal scraped once, faint and unmistakable. Stone over hardware, weight shifting from beneath. Keith's hand hovered over the mechanical lockdown lever as another sound followed. A muted click, then the soft lift of something heavy unlocking where no door was supposed to exist. The panel didn't swing like a door. It rose in a slow hydraulic shudder, a rectangle of faux concrete lifting flush from the corridor wall where no seam should have existed. A gloved hand appeared first, then a shoulder in contractor gray, then 2 men climbed through from the dark crawl space beyond. Both wore hard hats and dust masks. One carried a narrow document case. The other had a compact canister rigged to a spray wand and a pouch of tools. Keith stayed still in shadow until both boots touched corridor tile. Timestamp 0201, he said quietly to his body cam. Two unauthorized subjects emerged from concealed panel, inner chamber, east corridor. The man with the spray wand turned at the sound. His headlamp beam cut across Keith's chest, caught the insignia patch he hadn't removed. "Move!" the second man hissed. Keith stepped out and hit the wall control with his left hand. Steel shutters slammed down at both ends of the corridor with a thunderous crack. Emergency lights snapped from white to amber. The two men froze, then spun toward opposite exits that were already sealed. "National Tomb Annex Guard," Keith said, voice amplified by corridor acoustics. "Drop the tools. Face the camera and show your badges." Instead, the spray wand man snapped his wrist and fired a fan of clear solvent across the nearest shutter's keypad. The panel sparked and died. "Darnell, Iqbal, confirm lock status," Keith barked into comms. "Bravo sealed," Darnell answered. "No egress." The second intruder pivoted and charged straight at Keith, case swinging like a bludgeon. Keith stepped inside the arc, took the hit on his shoulder, and drove his forearm into the man's sternum. They collided against the memorial wall. The case popped open, spilling plastic sleeves stuffed with old paper, stamp tabs, and one brittle map acetate marked in grease pencil coordinates, casualty ledgers. The spray wand man lunged to scoop them, boots skidding. His heel flashed under amber light, outer crescent worn thin, exactly the pattern Keith had remembered. "Halden," Keith said, breath hard. "Mask off." The man paused, then laughed once behind the filter. "You always were romantic about process." He ripped the mask down. Bryce Halden's donor smile was gone. In its place was raw contempt. "You could have filed contamination and kept your pension," Halden said. "Now you're trespassing in your own building." Keith kicked the solvent canister away as the second man regained his footing and pulled a stun baton from his sleeve. "Not contractor issue." "Badges," Keith repeated. Halden flashed one toward camera, fast. Keith caught enough to read the print. "Facilities Temp, M. Dacre." "Read it aloud," Keith said. "Go to hell." The baton cracked against Keith's upper arm, numbing it to the fingertips. He grabbed the attacker's wrist with his good hand, slammed it against the wall twice until the baton clattered free, then hooked a leg and sent the man down hard. Halden bolted for the still open hidden panel. Keith lunged, caught the back of Halden's coveralls, and yanked him into camera cone, pinning him against the corridor floor with a knee between shoulder blades. "Timestamp 0203, Keith said into the cam, each word deliberate. "Subject 1, identified visually as Bryce Halden, private security consultant. Subject 2, using temp credential M. Dacre. Document materials recovered on floor." In his ear, Iqbal's voice broke in, urgent. "Control room just initiated alarm bypass override. User tag, G. Sloat, admin operations. Graham Sloat, night administrative coordinator, Veronan's scheduler, always carrying 2 tablets and apologizing when no one asked. Amber lights flickered red. Halden, face pressed to tile, smiled through clenched teeth. "You think this hall is your battlefield. It's a procurement calendar, Keith. Everything moves if signatures move." The shutters at the corridor ends jolted upward 1 inch, then 2. Keith looked to the bronze relief panel beside the chamber door, the legacy mechanical system everyone called obsolete. He had one shot. "Iqbal, Darnell, maintain perimeter. No one enters. I'm engaging manual protocol." He released Halden only long enough to drive him face first into the wall and zip-tie his wrists with restraint ties from his maintenance pouch. The second intruder rolled, grabbed a loose ledger sleeve, and fumbled for a lighter. Keith kicked the man's hand so hard the lighter spun into darkness, then stomped it flat. "Not one page," he snarled. The red lights strobed faster. Somewhere beyond, gears started cycling. He crossed to the bronze panel, slammed his override token into the concealed slot, and pulled the iron lever down. Nothing happened. Halden laughed from the floor. "Legacy lock requires dual confirmation from control." Keith tasted blood where he'd bitten his cheek. Of course it did. In his ear, static. Then Talia's voice, breathless, too loud, cutting through fan noise. "Keith, I'm in lower mechanical. Sloat's in control room trying to clear the lock queue. He's deleting your camera mirrors. What are you doing on site?" "Making bad decisions. Tell me what system state you're in." "Legacy lock primed. Needs second confirm." "Not if you isolate pneumatic line." Metal clanged over her mic. "There's a manual pressure wheel in corridor C, labeled 3B/3C failsafe. Turn it full clockwise after lever drop, and it hard seals independent of digital consent." "I don't have corridor C." "I do." Halden twisted against Ty, shouting, "She's unauthorized! Every second as she's in there contaminates evidence!" Talia came back over comms, voice shaking and iron at once. "I know I'm unauthorized. I also know you used PDMS mold release and brass on steel lift rails. I swabbed your seam. I signed it with my name. You don't get to hide behind policy after crawling under a memorial with solvent." A distant alarm horn gave one flat note. Then, through the building's bones, Keith felt it, a deep mechanical thud, old bolts driving home. Both shutters crashed fully down. The hidden panel behind the intruders dropped and deadlocked with a boom. System lights switched from red to solid white. Legacy lockdown active flashed on the dead keypad in ghostly green backup. Halden's expression changed for the first time. Not fear, calculation failing. He rolled to his side and shouted toward the ceiling, "Graham! Purge the archive! Trigger solvent!" No answer. In Keith's earpiece, Darnell, "We have admin staff detained at control. Sloat attempted to pull main breaker, failed. Talia pinned him with door wedge until we got there." Keith let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Good," he said. "Hold all positions. Military police are en route." Halden laughed again, thinner now. "You think MPs matter? By dawn, this reads as rogue guard, unauthorized consultant, compromised chain. You'll be the cautionary memo." Keith crouched in front of him, camera inches from Halden's face. "Maybe," he said, "but this memo has your name, your boots, your badge, and your hands on their dead." Military police sirens didn't wail in the annex. They arrived with lights off and boots loud. At 2:19, 2 MP teams stacked outside both sealed corridor ends. Keith keyed manual release only after body cam timestamp and verbal inventory of suspects, tools, and recovered documents. He made himself say everything clearly despite the throbbing in his arm. Subject 1. Bryce Halden. Consultant credential attached to Annex Modernization Contract. Subject 2. Male, carries temp facilities, badge M. Dacre, likely alias. Subject 3, detained at control room, Graham Sloat, admin operations. Evidence includes solvent tools, forged access credentials, and archival materials from inner vault handling sequence. The MP Lieutenant, Captain Imani Shah, listened without interrupting. "Who authorized this operation?" "No one," Keith said. "I initiated unauthorized controlled watch after preservation channels were blocked." Shah held his gaze for a beat that measured consequences. Then she nodded once. "Understood. We'll sort Command Payne later." They cuffed Halden first. He didn't struggle until Shaw ordered his boots bagged for evidence. "Careful with those," Halden said with a sneer. "Custom work. Hard to replace." Shaw looked up. "Great. Distinctive wear pattern. Saves us lab time." The second intruder refused to give a name until MPS removed his mask and ran portable scan. Match returned in 30 seconds. Marcel Dacker, subcontractor with sealed fraud complaints tied to a procurement lobby group called Meridian Civic Strategies. When they brought Sloat down from control, his tie was gone. Shirt sweat-soaked, hands ink-smudged from trying to manually yank printer ribbons in the panic. He spotted Keith and shouted before anyone asked him anything. "He said it was records harmonization," Sloat blurted. Halden said there were duplicate casualty entries and map inconsistencies that would humiliate the ministry before Election Memorial Week. "I never touched vault content. I only opened bypass windows." Halden snapped at him. "Shut your mouth." "No, you shut yours," Sloat's voice cracked. "You said Director Veronin approved." Captain Shaw turned to Keith. "Did she?" Keith answered carefully. "Director Veronin pressured reclassification and evidence suppression. I have no direct evidence she approved theft." Sloat sagged, breathing fast. "I forwarded her scheduling notes, not details. She wanted no scandal, no ghost headlines." Halden filled the rest. There it was, the seam between political cowardice and criminal intent. At 2:46, Veronin arrived in a coat thrown over night clothes, hair pinned in haste, fury running ahead of her. She stopped dead when she saw MPS, zip-tied evidence bags, and Halden on his knees beside the wall. "What have you done?" she demanded, eyes on Keith. He held out a tablet with body cam playback cued. Halden, emerging from the hidden panel, face visible, ledger sleeves scattering across memorial tile. "What you told me not to document," Keith said. Veronin watched 10 silent seconds, then another 10. Color drained from her face. Halden leaned back toward her, cuffed hands rattling. "Lena, tell them this was authorized systems audit." She didn't look at him. "I never authorized entry into the archival corridor." "Not in writing," Halden said. Captain Shaw stepped between them. "Save statements for formal interview." Halden's defiance finally cracked into something uglier. "Do you have any idea what's in those ledgers?" he shouted at Shaw, at Keith, at the room. "Units listed where they were never deployed. Casualty totals mismatched to briefings. Families told one grid while bodies were logged in another. You call it memory. It's exposure. Elections swing on less." Keith picked up a fallen sleeve with gloved fingers and held it where Halden could see the faded handwriting through plastic. "Then exposure happens in daylight," Keith said. "Not in tunnels." Halden spat blood-tinged saliva on the floor near his own boot. "Daylight is negotiated." "Not tonight," Keith said. By 3:10, all 3 suspects were in transport restraints. MPs secured the hidden access route with forensic tape from panel to crawl space to the service run under East Approach. Talia, gray-faced and shaking from adrenaline and claustrophobia, still gave Captain Shaw a clean verbal of the pneumatic isolation she had executed. "I am fully aware I violated site removal order," she said. "Charge me if needed, but log that the admin terminal was mid-delete when I entered control. I photographed screens before intervention." Shaw took the phone, reviewed the images, and gave a short nod. "You just made my paperwork much easier." Keith finally sat on the corridor bench when everyone else started moving like aftermath instead of combat. His right arm had gone from numb to molten ache. Darnell dropped beside him, handed over a bottle of water. "You look terrible," Darnell said. "Thanks." Iqbal leaned against the opposite wall, grime streaked across his cheek. For the record, if we get fired, I'm blaming your leadership style. Fair. They all laughed once, thin and disbelieving. At 3:32, Keith's phone buzzed with one new message from an unknown number. Mateo here, Ant said. Call only public line. I heard MPS came. Did someone really come out from under the stone? Keith typed back with stiff fingers. Yes. You were right about the scrape and resin. Your statement matters. Stay safe. We'll contact formally. 3 dots appeared, vanished, returned. I thought I was losing it. Keith stared at that for a long second before replying, You weren't. Dawn came pale and cold over a building that had not slept. At 6:05, Keith gave his first sworn statement in a windowless interview room that smelled of copier toner and burnt coffee. He finished at 7:11, signed each page, and initialed corrections where his handwriting shook. At 7:30, Internal Affairs handed him a printed notice. Formal reprimand pending, procedural deviation, and unauthorized operational action. Same old machine, still turning. At 7:33, Captain Shaw handed him another paper. Command Commendation Recommendation. Preservation of Federal War Archive Evidence under active tampering threat. Both documents sat side by side on the table. Absurd twins. Outside the interview room, Talia waited with her jacket zipped to her chin and a paper cup gone cold in her hand. Dark circles under her eyes, dust still on her boots. You okay? She asked. He almost said yes out of reflex. Instead, no. You? She huffed a laugh. Also no. They stood in silence while a clerk wheeled past 2 sealed evidence trunks marked Archive/Chain A. The world had changed in the most bureaucratic way possible. Nothing looked different yet. And everything was different now that the right people had seen what the cameras held. Colonel Bell called twice, Talia said. I gave her copies of my lab report and your timestamp index like you asked. Oversight Council requested immediate hold on all renovation contracts tied to Meridian. Good. Also, she added, eyes narrowing, I nearly had a panic freeze in that lower corridor. 2 minutes, maybe less. I sat on the floor, talked myself through valve labels, then kept moving. Keith turned fully toward her. You kept moving. I did. Her mouth trembled once, then steadied. I'm tired of pretending fear disqualifies me from doing the right thing. He nodded. It doesn't. A PA chime echoed through the hall. All non-essential staff report for emergency briefing at 8 o'clock. Through the glass wall, he could see Voronin at the far end of the corridor, speaking to 2 legal officers, posture rigid as rebar. She met Keith's gaze across the distance. No apology, no accusation. Just the hollow look of someone discovering too late which line she had crossed by standing near it. Talia followed his eyes. What happens now? He watched MPS roll Halden past in cuffs, consultant grin gone, hair flattened with sweat, still trying to speak to anyone who would listen. Now, Keith said, it gets loud. It got loud that evening on the annex roof, where HVAC units hummed and city lights blurred in the drizzle. Not public roof. Service roof, plain concrete, no memorial framing. Keith had come up because he couldn't sit through another debrief room without hitting something. He heard the stair door open behind him and didn't turn until Talia said, If you throw me out, I'm citing emergency emotional access. He almost smiled. Didn't know that clause existed. I drafted it. She walked to the parapet and stood shoulder to shoulder with him, close enough that their sleeves touched. For a while, they just watched rain bead on the floodlights below. I testified to Internal Affairs, she said at last. They asked why I re-entered after escort. I told them because the alternative was letting men with solvent rewrite dead people. Good answer. They asked if I have a personal relationship with you that impaired judgment. She looked at him directly now. I said yes and no. His throat tightened. Which part was yes? The part where your call matters to me more than it should for a former colleague. Her fingers tapped nervous rhythm against wet concrete. The no was that my judgment was clear. I knew exactly what I was risking. He exhaled slowly. Talia. No, let me finish before I lose nerve. Her voice shook, then steadied in sheer will. Route Green messed me up. You know that. I rebuilt my life by keeping everything compartmentalized. Work here, panic there, feelings nowhere. You were the one person who never asked me to be less afraid than I was. You just stayed, quietly, reliably. And I told myself that was enough. She laughed once, soft and angry at herself. It wasn't enough. Rain spattered harder, ticking against ductwork. I love you, she said. Not in a dramatic post-crisis way. In a long, stubborn, years-in-the-making way. I love your impossible ethics and your terrible timing and the way you still call it records when what you mean is people. I'm done pretending that's just camaraderie. Keith looked down at his hands. Scar across one knuckle, white in the roof light. When he spoke, his voice was rough. I should have said this years ago. Then say it now. He nodded once, as if to an order he'd finally accepted. I love you too. I loved you in that blackout shelter when you were counting bolts to breathe. I loved you every time I almost called and decided I had nothing but damaged pieces to offer. I loved you tonight when you told me you were scared and came anyway. Talia's eyes shone wet that wasn't rain. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because everyone I promised to protect ended up in a list. He swallowed. I built a life where silence felt safer for other people. I'm not other people, she said. I know. He stepped closer. I know now. She reached up, touched the bruising on his jaw with careful fingertips. This doesn't get easier tomorrow. There are hearings and lawyers and maybe your job on the line. Yeah. And I still have panic episodes in enclosed spaces. Yeah. And if we do this, I'm not doing half measures. His answer came without hesitation. Neither am I. For a second, neither moved, as if both had lived too long in controlled restraint to trust the release. Then Talia grabbed his coat and kissed him. Brief, fierce, rain-cold, and real. He kissed her back with the same contained intensity he brought to everything until containment finally broke, and he held her like he meant to stay. When they parted, they were both breathing hard. Talia rested her forehead against his. Okay, she whispered. Now what? He gave a tired, honest smile she had almost forgotten he possessed. Now I walk you downstairs, we eat something that isn't vending machine sugar, and tomorrow we tell the world the truth. And after that? He took her hand fully, interlacing fingers. After that, we keep choosing this, on ordinary days too. She squeezed once. Deal. Below them, dawn shift prep lights began flicking on around the courtyard. For the first time in years, the coming morning didn't feel like penance. The oversight hearing room had bad acoustics and worse coffee, but excellent microphones. 3 weeks later, Keith sat behind a nameplate that read K. Nakamura, senior guard, while cameras from 6 networks watched the annex become national argument. To his left sat Captain Shah. To his right sat Talia in a dark blazer, forensic credentials clipped to her lapel. In the second row, Colonel Bell sat ramrod straight, like she could physically hold the institution upright. On a large monitor, Mateo appeared via secure video from a legal office downtown, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles blanched. Counsel asked, Recruit Ruiz, why did you resign immediately? Mateo swallowed, glanced once off screen, then looked into camera. Because I saw prints appear where there weren't any 30 minutes earlier, and I heard scraping under the stone. I thought if I said that out loud, they'd call me unstable. He took a breath. I was wrong to leave post without full statement, but I wasn't wrong about what I heard. His resignation transcript, entered as Exhibit 12, landed harder than any pundit commentary. Premeditated psychological sabotage. Planned rumor vector. The ghost narrative had been engineered, not born. By afternoon, committee counsel had tied Halden and Dacre to Meridian civic strategies, and a procurement pressure campaign timed to an election season memorial rollout. Their target files included casualty discrepancy ledgers and field map overlays, documents that would have complicated official speeches by proving accounting gaps still unresolved. Command representatives tried to frame the night as an isolated security lapse. Then Shaw played Keith's body cam clip. Hidden panel opening, Halden's face, ledgers on tile. The room went very quiet. At 1940 that same day, HR called Keith into a small office and slid 2 envelopes across the desk. He opened the first. Formal reprimand for unauthorized operation. Opened the second. Official commendation for archive preservation under active tampering threat. He looked up. You're handing both? The HR officer, exhausted and sincere, nodded. For now. The next morning, after hearing transcripts went public and command pressure emails surfaced, a courier arrived at dawn with a third document. Reprimand rescinded, no speech, just paper. 2 months later, the new guard training bay smelled of rubber mats, limestone dust, and coffee brewed too strong. A whiteboard read, Ceremonial Discipline plus Forensic Awareness, Module 1. Instructor, Voss, T/Nakamura. K. Talia stood before 12 recruits, holding up a silicone casting sheet. Respect is not theater, she said. If you see something impossible, your job is not to become a story. Your job is to preserve evidence. Keith watched from the back until one recruit raised a hand. Sir, if command tells us to classify quickly for optics, Keith answered without looking at his notes. You document facts, not comfort. Then you escalate in writing where it can't be unsaid. At the side door, Mateo waited in fresh uniform, badge restored, shoulders still carrying humility, but no longer collapse. When break was called, he approached Keith. You sure about this? Mateo asked quietly. Putting me back east, watch? Keith considered him, then nodded toward the courtyard visible through glass. You saw what others missed. That belongs here. Mateo straightened. Understood, Sergeant. This time, Keith corrected him gently. Keith is fine. Respectfully, no, Mateo said, a hint of grin. Sergeant, Fitz. Keith let it pass. Before dawn on the first clear day of autumn, Keith resumed the opening route he knew by sound. Granite click, bronze hush, granite again. The east approach had been repoured under forensic supervision, with no hidden seams, no decorative shortcuts. Just stone curing honestly under weather. Talia stood near the rope line with a clipboard, hair tucked under a knit cap, pretending to inspect stanchion, spacing while sipping terrible coffee. She caught his eye as he passed and lifted the cup in salute. Darnell and Iqbal traded posts at the arcade with their usual argument about whose turn it was to buy breakfast. Colonel Bell spoke quietly with a family near the inscription wall. Mateo logged perimeter check at 4:30 and again at 5:58, handwriting neat, no tremor. When the first light broke over the annex, it laid itself across the path and revealed only what should have been there. The gradual, truthful wear of disciplined boots, each step accountable to the last. Keith paused at the chamber threshold. gloved hand resting lightly on cool stone. For those returned without names, for those not returned at all, for the living who still had to choose what memory cost. Behind him, Talia's footsteps approached, steady, unhidden. He didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. He could hear exactly where the sound changed.